The day an elder told me his people had been meeting with a presence in the woods for decades, I laughed out loud and kept walking. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was a trail inspector for the Regional Forest Service for 11 years, trained in erosion assessment, public safety, and incident reporting. I had mapped over 1,000 kilometers of trails, handled complaints about illegal camps, and learned to read soil compaction like a book. That summer, in July of 2017, I was assigned to a remote corridor in the Cascadia foothills where a caretaker community had complained of unusual damage to a series of connector trails. What I found there would undo parts of what I believed about the border between human work and older presences. I am going to show you the footprints, the broken foundations, the samples, and the report that forced an agency to act and a community to change how it guards a place they call sacred. My weeks had been predictable. I drove the same gravel roads, packed the same kit, checked gauges, photographed erosion pins, and remote signage. The routine was instruments and checklists. I carried a camera, a soil probe, a GPS, a first aid kit, and a notebook in which I wrote measurements in neat columns. I worked with Ranger Marcus Reed and reported to Chief Owen Baker. Marcus and I had a shorthand. He called me Dan, I called him Reed, and between us we could parse a bad trail in 15 minutes. My expectations that morning were simple. Inspect a washed boardwalk, record vegetation loss, make a maintenance ticket. The caretaker who met me at the trailhead, Naomi Cruz, handed me a thermos and a folded paper map with inked circles where the damage was worst. Her hands were calloused from tending footbridges, and her voice held the wary cadence of someone who had seen recurrent patterns that did not fit familiar explanations. The walk-in was the first signal. The air tasted of resin and wet stone, sweet and sharp. Birds went silent in a way that felt deliberate. Their absence was its own sound. Sunlight filtered through a canopy of old firs and cedars and fell in thin, trembling blades. The trail surface alternated between spongy patches of moss and compressed clay. I noticed odd grooves in the mud, parallel and sunken, too wide for a boot, too aligned for a felled log. The sound of a creek undercut the slope, and the smell of cold mineral water clung to the air. As we moved deeper, the vegetation grew younger, as if the forest had a margin where it recoiled. I snapped photos, logged coordinates, and jotted observational notes that soon read less like maintenance orders and more like an inventory of anomalies. We arrived at the first clearing, where a small wooden footbridge had been ripped from its abutments. The timbers were splintered but not sawn. There were impressions around the beams in the soil that suggested the application of force at a specific angle. I felt the roughness of a displaced board with my palm, tasted the metallic tang of exposed nails, heard the low hum of insects that had returned to the new light. Naomi pointed toward a set of depressions in damp earth beyond the bridge. "My Uncle Samuel saw them years ago," she said. "He said leave offerings and do not light a fire near the line." That sentence moved between us like a temperature change. Samuel Red Elk, the man she named, arrived a little later, wrapped in a faded jacket and carrying cedar bundles. He walked with a limp and small, precise steps. His eyes were the color of riverstone, and his voice was a fold of old weather. "Who did you bring here?" I asked him, practical and perhaps a little rude from habit, to show me evidence of a simple washed-out bridge? Samuel looked at my hands, at the camera on my chest, at the GPS clipped to my belt. He smiled in a way that acknowledged both my tools and the limits of them. "You come to measure what you can see," he said. "You cannot measure what keeps watch." He gave me a sachet sewn from hide and tucked 2 leaves and a smudge of tobacco inside. I hesitated and accepted it because in that place etiquette was also a protocol. He explained, in his soft way, that his mother had sat with something in the clearing when she was a child, that his people had left cloth and smoked cedar, and that in exchange certain paths were left alone. Lena Blackfeather, the community knowledge keeper, joined us and set small stones in a ring. She spoke of rituals as if they were parts of the terrain, practical acts of demarcation. I asked questions. She answered not with stories of monsters, but with accounts of boundaries respected, of tracks that appeared when heavy equipment came near, and of a pattern of response to noise and vibration. Marcus arrived, breathless from a detour. He immediately began a chain of practical questions about recent logging and vehicles. We talked in a series of short exchanges that grew longer as the creek sounded like an argument under us. Dialogue with Samuel became a cadence we returned to across hours. "How often do they come?" I asked. "Decades," Samuel said. "My grandparents left offerings before any logging trucks came through," Lena interjected. "Have you seen them?" Marcus asked. Samuel looked at him. "I have seen a shadow stand upright where there should be light," he said. "It looked like the driftwood of a storm shaping itself into a watchman." "That is not evidence," I replied, "a reflex of training. Evidence is prints, samples, measurements." Samuel nodded. "Then you will take the prints and the samples and you will listen," he said. "We do not ask for belief, we ask for guard." The conversation stretched. I asked where, and he pointed to an old embankment near a foundation of stones half covered in moss. There were depressions like the bed of a different creature. I photographed them closely and felt the cool mud between my fingers. The instruments we used read moisture and density, and the patterns were inconsistent with known animal stride lengths. The first inevitable moment of tension arrived when we found the primary impression field. The site smelled of crushed moss and river sediment. The prints were broad and deep, with a cleft that suggested a heel pad but no drive marks from acceleration. I crouched and ran a gloved hand over the edge, and felt hair caught on a root. The hair was coarse and dark. We bagged it and labeled it as Sample A3. I heard nothing for a long beat. Then a low knocking began, 3 hits on hollow wood to our left. Naomi whispered, "They knock on trees to say approach or to warn." Marcus and I looked at each other, and our training kicked in. Measure wind, check for nearby hikers, scan for mechanical sources. There was none. The knocking continued, deliberate and slow, and the hair on my forearms rose. That night would be the first of several where sleep would be frayed by the memory of those knocks. Backstory is a thread I now need to lay out because it explains why I was both skeptical and later compelled. I grew up in a house on the edge of a suburban sprawl, the son of a civil engineer and a kindergarten teacher. My father taught me to read contour maps at 10 and to respect a well-placed culvert. My mother taught me to listen to stories at the table, to fold them into how we see people. When I was 18, I hiked for a summer with Marcus, then a college student, and we learned the ropes of the Forest Service. I joined the force because I liked clear rules. I learned to value evidence over legend. That changed when my wife Clara died unexpectedly 5 years before this assignment. Loss narrowed my sense of control and widened a small, stubborn space for wondering why the world could hold things I could not tidy away. Those personal losses made me more attentive to small rituals and to the way communities, like the caretakers we met, kept fragile things whole. Samuel, Lena, Naomi, and others were not merely sources of lore. They were residents with a pattern of mutual care that involved sacrifice and secrecy. I was trained to file reports. I had never been trained to carry obligations. That tension between the paperwork of a job and the moral weight of what the people asked of me became a second backbone of this story. It is why later I chose to return to a clearing at dawn barefoot in the wet and to sign off on a report that demanded institutional response rather than a simple maintenance ticket. After our initial recording of the site, we split tasks. Marcus and I cleared a perimeter and set up temporary markers. Naomi and Lena performed a small ritual that consisted of laying tobacco at the threshold and whispering precise phrases. Samuel watched the ridge like a person scanning both sky and route at once. Conversations during that afternoon were long and practical. Marcus asked about recent geotechnical surveys and logging permits. I called Dr. Lila Chen at a university lab and described the hair sample in clipped sentences. Dr. Chen asked for photos and GPS coordinates and promised to take a look. Later, Elias Marlowe, a regional geologist, arrived by four-wheeler and knelt by a set of small concrete foundations sunk into the slope. He measured and muttered about a possible clandestine survey done for resource mapping. If there's vibration testing or boreholes nearby, he said, it could provoke responses from fauna or other long-term inhabitants. His hands smelled of diesel and coffee and sweet, chalky dust. He named a set of coordinates and promised a follow-up survey. Dialogue that afternoon grew more insistent. I asked Dr. Chen on the phone, "Can hair like this tell us species?" She answered carefully, "If we have follicular remnants and DNA, yes. Send the chain of custody documentation and freeze samples." "We do not know who else to call," I said. "That is fine," she replied. "We will treat it as an unclassified biological sample. If it is human, we will report to the proper authorities. If not, we will report to you and to the lab." The exchange was calm but held a tension about jurisdiction and protocol. Marcus and Owen argued, quietly, about whether to issue a temporary closure for the trail. Naomi and Lena wanted closure quick. Samuel wanted time to perform a boundary renewal. I found myself mediating procedures with an ear to ritual needs. The CTA moment comes now because I want a record from you, the viewer, and because this case shifted once community testimony met physical evidence. If you have ever felt a tension like this on a trail, if you have ever found a marking that made you stop, please share it starting with the phrase, "I saw." We want to collect accounts that might mirror patterns across regions. Have you experienced odd knocks on trees? A sudden silence of birds, or prints too wide to be bear or elk? Start your comment with "I saw," and then the location. Your testimony helps shape investigations and points us to new sites worth checking. If you have photographs, dates, or coordinates, include them. We use this community material to vet leads and to ask labs like the one Dr. Chen runs to prioritize samples. Your stories matter and help form a network that protects fragile places. Now back to what happened that night. That evening, we camped in a small, pre-existing clearing with a low wind and a sky the color of old tin. The smells were of damp earth, smoldering cedar, and the oily tang of an old flashlight battery. We set a perimeter of low lanterns and had a heater for warmth. I lay awake on a foam pad and listened to the forest hold its breath. At about 1 in the morning, 3 clear knocks sounded, then pause, then another set. Naomi sat up, whispered to Samuel. He answered in low syllables and then stood to leave the circle. Marcus reached for a radio. I told him not to use it, that we should keep human sound minimal. The knocks were specific and close. The hairs on my neck rose, and I tasted rust in my mouth, a flash of adrenaline nausea that felt both physical and animal. We moved slowly, shoes muffled on pine duff, and found a series of prints in the mud around the perimeter. Dialogue here was rapid and tense. "Watch," Marcus breathed. "No sudden moves." Samuel knelt and whispered to the ground. Lena hummed under her breath and placed a circle of small stones around one of the prints. "They will not cross the line," she said. "They test the edge." I took measurements with trembling hands. Each print was longer than my boot, wide in the ball, with a curve in the toe like a slow grasp. "Is it human?" I asked. "Not human in our sense," Samuel replied. "Not animal in the way you track them." Marcus looked at me, his face tight. "We need photos, samples, and to log time," he said. "If this is an unknown animal that interacts with structures, this is not a public safety issue only. It is ecological." There were 15 exchanges in that scene, each short, clipped, and full of instrument-led directives and ritual replies. The forest seemed to lean in. Moment of tension number 1 expanded into a longer sequence. I wrote later in my report that I felt watched, not from above, but from a horizon that was a step wide. The knocks resumed in a pattern that matched the measured intervals of a ritual drum rather than an animal startled by a human camp. We recorded sound on a small device. The playback later contained subsonic pulses that our ears acknowledged as pressure more than tone. For 6 minutes, the knocking circled the clearing and then stopped. When it stopped, a breeze passed through and the owls began again, as if nothing had happened. Over the next days, we collected more evidence. Dr. Chen emailed that the hair sample was inconclusive for known species, but contained structural proteins with anomalous markers. Elias found small depressions in a slope below an old foundation that suggested a constructed shelter of woven branches, not recent but actively maintained. We cataloged scratches on bark that matched repeated patterns, and we photographed a faint geometry in the moss, a layout that suggested intentional placement of stones within the foundation. The intersection of these physical signs, consistent community testimony, moved the case out of my notebook into formal channels. I filed an urgent report with the Forest Service noting potential disturbance and requested a coordinated trespass and vibration survey. Tension moment number 2 came when a private contractor arrived the next week claiming to have rights to a subsurface survey previously permitted by an outside firm. We found heavy equipment tracks at a secondary access about 3 kilometers away. Marcus and I confronted the crew leader, a man named Marcus Caldwell, who carried a clipboard and an oily cap, and the exchange became legal and procedural. "You have permits," he said. "We are within authorized corridor." "Your vehicles have left unauthorized ruts," I replied. "We will need to see documentation and respect the closure until we finish assessments." He demanded to finish work. Samuel arrived and laid a cedar bundle on the hood of a vehicle. The crew laughed at him and moved forward. I called the chief and requested intervention. Later, under a low rain, the crew's equipment failed mysteriously. A hydraulic line blew and they reported electrical faults. They withdrew. No one said it aloud, but we all suspected that something had made the corridor inhospitable to machine work. We interviewed 7 local witnesses and named them in statements: Naomi Cruz, Samuel Red Elk, Lena Blackfeather, Marcus Reed, Owen Baker, Dr. Lila Chen, and Elias Marlowe. Each provided a particular piece. Naomi, the caretaking route history; Samuel, the ritual protocol; Lena, the oral boundaries; Marcus, the trail data; Owen, the operational directives; Dr. Chen, the preliminary lab interpretation; and Elias, the geological context. Their testimonies reinforced the pattern. When heavy vibration or invasive work approached, the phenomena intensified. The investigative phase required both cultural sensitivity and technical rigor. We employed ground-penetrating radar within a legal oversight and obtained core samples around the foundation areas. The technical explanation I later wrote into the report summarized the procedure. We used a GPR sweep at 400 MHz across transects, extracted core samples at 3 depths for soil composition and organic content, and sent hair and bark scrapings for genetic and isotope analysis under chain of custody. Results were to be compared with known regional fauna baselines. The protocol aimed to bridge cultural testimony with empirical validation. Moment of tension number 3 occurred during a midnight survey when our handheld lights revealed a silhouette at the edge of a distant clearing. The shape hunched and then rose, taller than a person, broad through the shoulders, and it moved with an economy that suggested curiosity rather than aggression. We froze. Naomi whispered a prayer. Samuel spoke a low word that I did not understand and that had the effect of insisting the silhouette hold its place. After what felt like an hour, the shape stepped back and disappeared into the dark. My hands shook as I transcribed coordinates. We later compared notes and found our watches synchronized to within seconds at the sighting. The moment lodged as a proving knot between narrative and instrument. Institutional response was slow but decisive once the evidence compiled. I wrote a detailed preliminary report that included photographs, GPS tracks, witness statements, GPR data, hair and soil sample references, and a cover note from Chief Owen Baker requesting an emergency hold on any subsurface contracts. The regional office opened an inquiry and placed temporary demarcation and a protective buffer. Dr. Chen published a short note about an unidentifiable keratin structure and requested further funding. Elias produced a map showing that the surveyed corridor crossed an ancient embankment that local storytellers had long treated as sacred. The overlap of potential resource interest and sacred boundary made the issue both ecological and cultural. We convened a meeting at the community hall with representatives from the Forest Authority, the caretaker group, and a liaison from the Regional Environmental Protection Agency. The exchanges in that meeting were formal but carried undercurrents of grief and insistence. "We need closure," Lena told the officials. "We need the sites safeguarded and the rituals allowed to proceed." The agency proposed a moratorium on heavy work until a joint management plan could be written. Naomi and Samuel agreed to document ceremonial markers in a way that the agency could recognize administratively. Marcus and I worked to draft a field protocol that asked for pre-work consultation, vibration monitoring, and cultural oversight. Moment of tension number 4 was the night an unmarked truck returned and idled near a lower trailhead. Lights flashed, equipment clanged, and someone tried to cross the demarcation with a quad. Samuel and 2 caretakers confronted the vehicle at dawn and were threatened. I arrived with legal observers and we de-escalated into a standoff. The truck left after an hour. We filed a complaint and the agency sent a compliance officer. Elias and Dr. Chen backed our samples with reports, and the contractor who had moved in without notice accepted a suspension pending investigation. The outcome was imperfect, but it signaled that institutional weight could back a cultural boundary when provided with evidence. The epilogue is where the real change takes shape and where my own transformation is recorded. What began as a trail maintenance request became a cross-cultural preservation case with practical protections and procedural templates. The agency formalized an interim protocol for projects intersecting designated cultural margins that included consultation with caretakers, a technical baseline survey, and an agreed pause if anomalous evidence like wide impressions or unexplained structural failure appeared. The caretakers agreed to provide a mapped registry of traditional boundaries in a format the agency could use while maintaining sensitive information in protected files. Naomi became an authorized stewardship monitor with conditional access to certain reporting channels. Lena and Samuel were invited to co-author a memorandum on ritual protocols for field staff, and Dr. Chen obtained funding to perform more comprehensive genetic analyses that paired lab data with cultural context. Legally, the moratorium held for 9 months while a negotiated management plan could be written.
Reviewed. Some contractors withdrew, others learned to coordinate. The private firm that had attempted illicit mapping accepted an internal review and altered its practices. The physical scars on the trail were repaired in ways that tried to minimize intrusive machinery, using manual labor and low-impact techniques recommended by Elias. Community response included a small signage program that discreetly marked the boundary and a stewardship policy that allowed caretakers to speak for the land without exposing sites to looting. These were not perfect remedies, but they were concrete changes that arose from a combination of evidence and testimony. Personally, the case changed my sense of what a guardian did. I learned to carry a different weight in reports and to translate ritual practices into procedural hooks that an agency could act upon. I kept a copy of the sachet Samuel had given me in my pack for months, not as superstition, but as a reminder that protection sometimes requires humility rather than control. I returned to the clearing many times, each visit layered with the same sensory catalog. The smell of wet cedar in early autumn, the taste of cold creek water after a long walk, the feel of rich loam in my fingers, the sight of bird flight resuming after an interval of silence, the sound of distant knocking that still made my chest clamp and reflex. Months later, Dr. Chen reported that the hair sample did not match known deer, bear, or human mitochondrial sequences cataloged in the lab. The marker patterns were anomalous, suggestive of a lineage not represented in regional baselines. She urged caution and more sampling. We published a preliminary field report that balanced scientific uncertainty and cultural testimony and recommended long-term monitoring rather than sensational claims. The caretakers changed their protocols for offerings and for informing agencies when boundaries were tested. The agency drafted new language for project permits that required pre-work cultural consultations and a plan for immediate suspension if evidence like the prints we recorded appeared. In closing, what started with a washed-out bridge turned into a lesson about listening, about how institutions can be slow but can also act when provided with clear evidence and respectful partnership. The presence we encountered on the border of that clearing did not become a spectacle for television. It became a reason for a community to secure its margins and for a service to rethink how it measures risk. If you take one thing away, let it be this. Protection of wild places is not only about fences and reports. It is about attending to the people who have knowledge, about documenting what is material and what is not, and about accepting that some of the most important evidence will come as a knock in the night and as a careful story handed across a pack of tobacco. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more investigations at the intersection of evidence and tradition. Our work depends on careful reporting and on
People who share their experiences in the field. Share this video with someone who hikes alone. And if you have a story that begins with, "I saw," put it in the comments. We read every account and use them to guide future fieldwork that protects places threatened by careless development. Thank you for listening and for keeping watch with us.